Well, welcome to another Friday night. A while ago, I started a series on understanding trauma. The goal was just to really give as thorough an explanation of trauma as possible, the different types of trauma. And today, what I want to do is come to what is known as generational trauma, and included in that is also collective trauma and historic trauma. And hopefully by the end of this, you're going to have a clear understanding of what we're talking about with those different types of trauma. So the first thing, just to help us understand this, is this. When we talk in the world of complex trauma, we talk about the fact that the original trauma happened outside of the person's family circle of interest. So it was an event, it was a foreign person they didn't know, but somebody got traumatized. Then that trauma didn't get resolved within that person. They weren't able to deal with it and process it and heal. And so now they come into their family system as the authority, the dad or the mom, and they perpetuate that trauma. And so now the trauma takes place from a loved one within a family system, and that becomes complex trauma, and that becomes generational trauma. That's what I want to explain this evening. Now, let me just add another piece to this to fill out your understanding. So, usually when we think of trauma, we think of traumatic events that happen to an individual. But what I want you to also consider is that traumatic events can also happen to a community, to a group of people, to a culture, to a nation. And that's collective trauma. So it's an event that happens to not just one person, but a whole group of people. So two books that have been very helpful and you might want to look into in understanding this. So the first is by Thomas Hubble, called Healing Collective Trauma. And the second is by Gayla Atlas, called Emotional Inheritance. Both very well written, very thorough in understanding this subject of collective generational trauma. So let me begin with this collective trauma. So a definition is, collective trauma is a shared psychological and emotional reaction to a catastrophic event affecting a very large number of people. The people surviving these terrible experiences not only have bad memories, but also suffer by trying to make sense of them through mental reconstructions of the traumatic events. In other words, the events that happen are so confusing and overwhelming that it's not just the pain of the event, it's the confusion and trying to understand, why did this happen? What was going on here? And not being able to totally make sense of this whole event. So let me give you some examples of collective trauma. And I'm going to go through these very quickly. So in the West, we think of slavery. And so it was the kidnapping and trafficking of large numbers of African people, bringing them over to the Americas and turning them into slaves. That's collective trauma. Then we think of the mass genocides of the First Nations people, the indigenous peoples, and that's all around the world. And so they were forced to move, they were killed, they were forced to change cultures. All of that happened. That's collective trauma. Then we think of the Holocaust, 6 million Jews wiped out. We think of the Nanking Massacre, which we're learning more and more about. We think of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We think of the Armenian genocide and Holodomor, a genocide of the Ukrainian people by the Soviet Union. We think of the 9/11 terrorist attack in New York City by Al-Qaeda. Then there's the Cambodian genocide carried out by the Khmer Rouge, the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Rwandan genocide, the ethnic cleansing, mass rape, torture, and enslavement that has happened throughout the world in different wars that has been there, the Darfur genocide, and then present day 6 million refugees of the Syrian civil war. All of those are collective trauma. So within that is a subcategory that is known as historical trauma. And so what it really is collective trauma that goes on and on and on over a period of time. So it's a complex and collective trauma experienced over time and across generations by a group of people who share an identity, affiliation, or circumstance. And so many collective traumas turn into historical traumas because they continue for years and years and generations. Dr. Marie Yellow Horse Braveheart originally conceptualized the model for historical trauma by defining it as cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma experiences. And so it continues, the collective trauma continues and turns into historical trauma because there's a group in power and their political and religious and cultural beliefs cause them to continue to suppress, discriminate against, be prejudiced against certain races, ethnicities, religions, genders, and that's what causes the systemic intolerance, the ongoing historical trauma. So let me just give you the results of collective trauma, just kind of very general terms. So the most common result when a large group of people goes through an atrocity is repression. That you can't talk about it. It's just too much. And so it becomes the elephant in the room, the secret that nobody talks about. So it is the emotional defense mechanism of repression that trivializes our memories and strips them of meaning. Repression protects us by splitting a memory from its emotional significance. In those cases, the trauma is held in the mind as an event that is not a big deal, nothing important, but it's not felt in the emotions. The disconnect between the ideas, the thinking, and the feelings allows us to protect ourselves from feeling something too devastating, but also keeps the trauma isolated and unprocessed. The collective function also limits our ability to examine our lives and live them to the fullest, because the subconscious brain has all of this pain that it can't process. So there's this repressing, don't talk about it thing that is a key piece to understand. And so then, in general terms, collective trauma causes a large number of people to hurt, but also then communities to suffer, and therefore that results in mental health issues, mental distress. And so we're going to look at that in more detail. But then it also can change a whole culture's attitudes and beliefs just overnight. So they can go from being very trusting and safe and believing a whole bunch of positive things to all of a sudden suspecting everybody, seeing anybody that's not like them, a stranger, as somebody who's a threat. And the whole mentality of the culture can change. And there's a polarization that can happen with that. But the one I want to focus on is that this unprocessed, untalked about trauma now becomes transgenerational. Because it's been repressed and unresolved, it now creates a cycle of trauma that's passed from one generation to the next. So those experiences that were too painful for us to entirely grasp and process are the ones that are passed down to the next generation. It is those traumas that are unspeakable and too painful for the mind to digest that become our own inheritance and impact our offspring and their offspring in ways they cannot understand or control. So transgenerational trauma or generational trauma or intergenerational trauma, all of those are different terms for what I want to just really focus on now. So let me give you a different kind of perspectives, comments, definitions that just fill out your understanding of what we're talking about. So a series of traumatic memories and experience passed from one generation to another, leading to negative psychological and emotional consequences. Number one. Then Jewish scholar Arthur Cohen describes it this way. It is the generation that bears the scar without the wound, sustaining memory without direct experience. So the second generation, the third generation, they didn't go through the original wound, the original trauma, but somehow they get the scars from that trauma. I think that's so insightful. Hungarian-born psychoanalysts Maria Torek and Nicholas Abraham used the word phantom to describe the many ways in which the second generation felt their parents' devastation and losses, even when the parents never talked about them. Their inherited feelings of the parents' unprocessed trauma were the phantoms that lived inside of them, the ghosts of the unsaid and unspeakable. It is those ghostly experiences, not quite alive, but also not dead, that we inherit. They invade our reality in visible and actual ways. We know and feel things, and we don't always recognize their source. We don't know why we're knowing and feeling those things. In his 2006 text, Healing the Soul Wound, clinical psychologist Eduardo Duran assessed that in the overall body of research on the subject of historical trauma and its transmission, there is evidence to suggest that not only is the trauma passed on intergenerationally, but it is cumulative. Duran further contends that when trauma is not dealt with in previous generations, it has to be dealt with in subsequent generations. When unresolved trauma is passed on, it may become more severe in successive generations. So it just keeps getting piled on more stuff in each generation that's not processed, and so it just gets worse, more severe as time passes. Unspoken suffering does not always disappear at the moment of death. It can be passed on. Over time, these ghosts become generational habits and live again and again in experiences such as cultural poverty, the secret violence visited upon our daughters, or in the denial of the emotional life of sons. These expressions are the legacy of our shared traumas, our collective karma, our denied, unprocessed, unintegrated past. Profound. Everything we do not consciously know is relived. It is held in our minds and in our bodies and makes itself known to us via what we call symptoms. Headaches, obsessions, phobias, insomnia can all be signs of what we have pushed away to the darkest recesses of our minds. The secrets of the mind include not only our own life experiences, but also those that we unknowingly carry with us. The memories, feelings, and traumas that we inherit from previous generations. So what you can see is there's a lot we don't understand still about the subconscious mind, but what we're beginning to understand is somehow in our subconscious mind, we're getting a package from previous generations that we might not even be aware of. So, to summarize it, the initial trauma comes from outside the family. But if the wounded person doesn't process their trauma and heal, and then they become an authority and start their own family, they then wound those they love the most. And now trauma is passed on within the family. And the next generation, it experiences indirectly the original trauma, but then they get extra traumas that are added on with each generation because of what this unhealed person is doing to the children. And that is generational trauma. So that leads to really an important question. Why does generational trauma happen? What are the dynamics that cause this passing on of trauma to the next generation? So there's a couple key things. So the one is very much biological, so nature, and the other one is nurture. Both play a profound effect on passing on of trauma. So the biological, the nature part is this whole study of epigenetics. And so we've done a talk on this, but epigenetics is the things over our genes that control what genes get turned on. And this is very much affected by the level of stress that a person is in as to what genes get turned on. And so what gets passed on to the next generation is not just the gene that's been turned on, but the epigenetic memory. And so those get passed on. So here's an important quote. It was after World War II that when psychoanalysts first began examining the impact of trauma on the next generation. And many of those analysts were Jews who had escaped Europe. Their patients were Holocaust survivors, and later the offspring of those Holocaust survivors, children who carried some unconscious trace of their ancestors' pain. So starting in the 1970s, neuroscience validated the psychoanalytical findings that survivors' trauma, even the darkest secrets that had never been talked about, had a real effect on their children and grandchildren's lives. And we're going to look at that part in a little bit. But in the 1990s, as epigenetics came on the radar, studies began to be focused on epigenetics and the non-genetic influences and modifications of gene expressions. So they analyzed how genes were altered in the descendants of trauma survivors and studied the ways in which the environment, and especially trauma, could leave a chemical mark on a person's genes that is passed down to the next generation. That empirical research emphasized the major role that stress hormones play in how the brain develops, and thus in the biological mechanisms by which trauma is transmitted from generation to generation. So basically what they began to realize is the genes were changed in the original trauma people, but then the markers from epigenetics and genes got passed on to the next generations as well. A large body of research done at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai Hospital by Dr. Rachel Yehuda, Director of Traumatic Stress Studies, and her team reveals that the offspring of Holocaust survivors have lower levels of cortisol, a hormone that helps the body bounce back after trauma. And so when you go through a scary event, your body releases cortisol to give you extra energy to fight or flight. When you get that too much, your body starts to shut down cortisol stuff and goes to the opioid freeze response. And so what they found is that the children of Holocaust survivors had lower cortisol levels than the average person. An article published in 2020 looked at epigenetic changes due to chronic stress and nutritional deficiencies in Black Americans during slavery in the United States. And they found that those changes have led to poor physical and mental health outcomes among Black Americans. For example, research has found that generational trauma contributes to a high risk for anxiety, depression, and high blood pressure among Black Americans. So the result of the genes that have changed due to the trauma, mental health issues, and health issues. So then studies done on indigenous people have found the exact same thing, that they are likelier to have poor mental health and physical health outcomes due to epigenetics. And that's passed on from generation to generation. In 1966, Canadian psychiatrist Vivian Rakoff and colleagues were some of the first to recognize the concept of generational trauma. The research team recorded higher rates of psychological distress among children of people who survived the Holocaust. In a study with 484 participants that were the adult children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, it was revealed that 35% of them had generalized anxiety disorder, 26% went through a major depressive episode, and 14% of them had PTSD. These psychological, emotional, and physiological reactions were summarized by the participants as living in survival mode. And they included fear, increased anxiety, mistrust, sadness, depression, decreased self-worth, social hostility, survival guilt, and numbing out. So it's not just that the epigenetics, the generational trauma affects the person physically, it also affects their mental health. In another qualitative study, the intergenerational impact of the 1932-33 Holodomor genocide on 3 generations in 15 Ukrainian families was investigated. The results show that a vast array of emotions, inner states, and trauma-based coping strategies emerged in the survivors during the genocide period, and that these were transmitted into the second and third generations. Dr. Gabor-Mate says this: "It's impossible to separate personal trauma and collective trauma because the very physiology of our nervous system is created in interaction with the nervous system of other people from the moment that we're conceived. Even in utero, the emotional states of the mother have an impact on the developing nervous system of the child, including all kinds of neurochemicals, chemical messengers, synapses, and connections. These states affect how the brain systems will evolve and to what degree, and this will have a lifelong impact. A study done in the aftermath of the Six-Day War in Israel in 1967 found that women who were pregnant then were more likely to have and had schizophrenic children as adults. What was happening collectively in the country was reflected in the individual neurobiology of infants in the womb. And we know this from multiple international studies. That's because our brains are really wired together. Since that happens on the neurobiological level, on the level of the nervous system and in the brain, and since the nervous system affects and is connected to every other organ in the body, it also happens on a biological level throughout the body, including in all the cells and all the organs and all the systems and so on. Therefore, it's not even possible to talk about trauma in purely individual terms. You may need to re-listen to that because there's a lot of really good stuff in that. So that's the biological, the nature part. Now let me give you the nurture part. And this to me is the complex trauma part. This is the significant part. So the original person, they go through their trauma, it's too much for them, so they go to fight, flight, or freeze. That becomes their main way of coping. They don't learn other tools for coping, and so now as soon as life gets too painful, too much stress, they just go to fight, flight, or freeze. Now they become parents. So what do their children now watch every day? They watch their role model only use a certain set of tools for coping with life. And so what do the children learn? They learn their parents' tools. They learn fight, flight, or freeze as their main ways of coping with life. But more than that, that original person that has been so damaged and is in fight, flight, or freeze, they've lost the ability, because of their own trauma, to connect to anybody, to be present to anybody. They've lost the ability to trust. They've lost the ability to regulate their own nervous system if it gets stimulated. They've lost the ability to be attuned to other people so that they can connect. And it's resulted in, they tend to dissociate very quickly. They tend to be angry a lot. They tend to be in their limbic brain all the time, and it gets dysregulated easily. So what happens when you have a parent like that? They don't connect with the child. They don't meet the 12 needs of the child. They wound the child. They create a complex trauma environment. And that is what happens in the generational. So because of all the undealt with wounds, the parent's not able to be a healthy, mature parent, meeting the 12 needs of their children, connecting with their children. And so their child gets wounded and lives in an environment that is not safe for them emotionally, even physically, and they end up with trauma. So let me go to the signs of generational trauma, the symptoms of generational trauma. And I want to give the very obvious ones and then the more subtle ones. So we've talked about the health issues that come out of it. So as we look at Black cultures, indigenous cultures, others that have gone through large collective trauma that's become historical trauma, we see heart disease, diabetes, cancer, autoimmune issues, that becomes part of their whole culture. Then there's the mental health issues, and we've talked about that. On top of that, these cultures have major shame issues that begin to be felt in every single person. They tend to be marked by an emotional numbness. They just don't feel much. They don't express emotions. Then there's a depersonalization. They just feel detached from everybody and everything. They feel almost alien as they pass through the world. That's part of a collective trauma that becomes a generational trauma. And so, because they don't get very many tools outside of fight, flight, freeze from their parents, they have impaired life skills when it comes to critical thinking, decision making, managing their time, good habits, good coping. And so that leads to long-term personal pain, developmental problems for individuals. All of that comes out of generational trauma. Then there tends to be higher mortality rates, troubling patterns of child abuse and domestic violence, increased incidence of drug and alcohol abuse. So these symptoms become social tendencies, such as collective numbness born from mass dissociation and denial of historical trauma, including its root causes and consequences. Collective numbness surfaces as epidemic substance misuse, food, sex, entertainment, addiction, media overuse, drugs, alcohol. It reveals itself as a collective shutting down to crisis as much as to healing. So they're trying to shut down all the pain, but they're also shutting down healing. On top of all of that, societies or cultures that have gone through collective trauma that's become generational trauma, there's a personal and collective sense of unresolved grief. You just feel it. There's just so much loss that has not been dealt with. That leads to a sense of hopelessness, often within the culture. Also, a real doubt and distrust and suspicion and negative outlook on life, on anybody that's not like them. And sadly for many, there develops a really learned helplessness. They see all the pain, they just feel helpless to do anything about it. They see all the problems in their culture, they feel helpless to do anything about it. They have so many problems in their own life, but they just feel they can't do anything about it. Then there's just this anger and aggression and violence that becomes part of the culture. And that can be directed at self, at property, at others, including members of one's own family, friends, culture, or ethnic group. Often, there develops a hatred towards your own culture. You just don't want any part of that culture. You're ashamed of your culture. You're embarrassed by your culture. And so you just develop a real aversion to your own culture. And then Bessel van der Kolk has highlighted something I think is really important. Many traumatized people expose themselves seemingly compulsively to situations reminiscent of the original trauma. These behavioral reenactments are rarely consciously understood to be related to early life experiences. So traumatized individuals often unconsciously reenact their prior victimization. In these dynamics, one may either take on the role of victim or victimizer. This pattern of unconscious reenactment is a major source of societal violence. In other words, People that have trauma or generational trauma set themselves up without even realizing it to get into situations where they're going to be traumatized again. It is so sad. Now, take it a little bit further. What happens then when you have a whole culture of collective trauma that's become historical trauma and now generational trauma is that society becomes more and more dysfunctional. The organizations within that society have greater dysfunction. So dysfunctional bonds and abusive dynamics, all because that's all they know. That's the templates that they've been raised with about what is normal. And so these get passed on largely unquestioned, largely unresolved, and so encoded now into the fabric of that society, the identity of that society is all of this dysfunctional ways of relating, dysfunctional ways of leadership. And so children who are born into that are born into a legacy of poverty and the risk of abuse. And many struggle then to make lives that are meaningful because they don't know what healthy is. Take that a little bit further. Once you get into those communities and those organizations, what you find is leadership that is so dysfunctional because of their own generational trauma that they're now creating toxic work environments that are wounding everybody that works for them. And those organizations begin to attract narcissists to be their leaders. And those then do even greater wounding. So now you have another layer of trauma that gets added on. That's why, if I can just, as an aside, make this note. So many cultures that have years of generations of generational trauma become so dysfunctional that they can no longer help themselves from within. They don't have anybody healthy enough to begin to help them change. They need somebody from the outside to come in and help them begin to understand healthy, begin to understand all the unhealthy dynamics. The problem is they don't trust outsiders. And so they reject outsiders. And that just keeps them stuck in all of these unhealthy dynamics and narcissistic leadership that just continues to do damage. There's another piece to generational trauma, and that is trauma bond. So often, because it's so dysfunctional, the way you create any sense of connection is a false sense of loyalty, that we gotta stick together. You can only trust blood. You only are there for family. And so what happens for many people is when they begin to realize this is toxic, I need to deal with this, I need to get healthy myself, that means they got to step outside of that culture, outside of their families and all the dysfunctional organizations, and they go, I can't do that. I got to be loyal to my family. I got to continue to be loyal to the people that are abusing me. And so many people don't stick at getting help to get healthy because they're afraid of being disloyal to the very people that are wounding them. Another symptom, which is so significant, and this is more a cultural thing, is that often with generational trauma, we begin to regress to earlier stages of development. So if you think back to kind of the cavemen, the Iron Age, where people, we just had little family systems that moved around and hunted, all of those things, anybody that was a stranger was a danger. And so you were suspicious of anybody you didn't know, anybody who wasn't like you. And so what can happen with collective trauma that turns into historical trauma and generational trauma is that now you regress to the point where we distrust everybody. It's polarization that takes place to we can only trust people like us. Everybody else is a potential enemy. And so you choose camps, you're suspicious of everybody, you turn on everybody, you fear anybody that's an outsider. This is a collective hyperarousal and hypervigilance. In the Middle East, violent conflict has persisted over centuries and generations culminating in a powerful polarization of the people of the region, splitting nationalities, ethnicities, and religions into fractured and warring identities. This energy of polarization regenerates the original crisis. Without resolution, after eruptive energy is expended, its primary contents are once again suppressed. So it starts a vicious cycle that just keeps this polarization happening and ongoing violence as the norm in life. The final one is Thomas Hubble says this: "Indeed, it is my belief that unresolved systemic multi-generational traumas delay the development of the human family, harm the natural world, and inhibit the higher evolution of our species. Unhealed collective trauma may place similar burdens on the health of human cultures and societies, even placing our planetary home at risk." In other words, when trauma isn't dealt with, the ripple effect first goes to the family, then it goes to the culture, then it goes to the world. All negative. It begins to delay the evolvement of love, the evolvement of creativity. It hinders us and it begins to hurt our very planet. And that's the world that we live in, sadly, right now. So the question becomes, how do you heal this? Where do you go from here? Let me refer to Dr. Judith Herman, and I've talked about her before, and she's done some excellent research around trauma. The ordinary response to atrocities is to banish them from our consciousness. And we talked about that. Repress it, don't talk about it. Certain violations of the social compact are too terrible to utter aloud. This is the meaning of the word unspeakable. Atrocities, however, refuse to be buried. Equally as powerful as the desire to deny atrocities is the conviction that denial does not work. Folk wisdom is filled with ghosts who refuse to rest in their graves until their stories are told. Murder will out. Remembering and telling the truth about terrible events are prerequisites for both the restoration of the social order and for healing of individual victims. The conflict between the will to deny horrible events and the will to proclaim them aloud is the central dialectic of psychological trauma. People who have survived atrocities often tell their stories in a highly emotional, contradictory, and fragmented manner, which undermines their credibility and thereby serves the twin imperatives of truth-telling and secrecy. When the truth is finally recognized, survivors can begin their recovery. But far too often, secrecy prevails, and the story of the traumatic event surfaces not as a verbal narrative, but as a symptom. So step one in healing, you got to talk about it. You got to break the secret. You got to talk about the thing that everybody's refused to talk about. Now, you're going to get opposition for doing this. You're going to get others that are going to try to shut you down and get you quiet and make it sound like we don't need to talk about that it's in the past. But unless we get it talked about, we can't heal. But what we've realized is there's a second piece that's so important. So originally, people thought, okay, just use talk therapy. Let's get people talking. And what they found is it helped to a degree, but it didn't totally help the person. It often just re-traumatized them. And what they began to realize is you have to talk in an environment of safety with safe people and connect. And so healing isn't just talking about it, it's building connection with safe people. And when you do that, that's where you can begin to really heal. Now, take that a step further, because what I want you to see is that a lot of people, when they start talking about it, they start talking about it with people that are their wounders, people that are their family, people in their communities that don't want to change, and they trying to form connection with the very people that are hurting them, and no connection is happening. no true connection. And so what they found is they have to create a surrogate family, a family of outsiders, safe people who aren't part of the culture of the family. And that's scary. But as they form these connections with a surrogate family of safe people, that's when the healing can happen. And so this journey of healing, you're facing two key fears right up front. Number one, to talk about it. Number two, to form connections with safe people who feel like outsiders. Those are so intense fears that those are major obstacles to overcome. But once you do, then some true key healing begins to happen, and the generational passing on of the trauma can stop. So for you who are parents, who have generations of trauma, one of your biggest concerns probably is, I don't want to give this to my kids. The way to do that, to stop the generational trauma, is to heal yourself. That's the greatest gift you can give to your kids. Well, that's the end of another Friday night. I really hope this just helps you to understand better, but also to give you hope that you can finally break the cycle. Have a great week.